Nintendo is one of the most iconic video game companies of all time. They have the most iconic systems, the best games sometimes, and a wide array of extremely popular characters. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, Nintendo has had a very rocky history, having very high highs and very low lows. But as of right now, the Nintendo Switch is the best performing modern system, outselling the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Hi, I'm Parker Sargent, and in this presentation, I will discuss the history of Nintendo and why they're so successful. It all began in the early 1800s when the Japanese government decided to ban traditional playing cards. This decision was made in an attempt to prevent or at least discourage illegal gambling in the country, which was a big issue at the time. Seeing an opportunity, Fusahiro Yamauchi created Hanafuda cards and started the company named Nintendo Koppai in the year 1889. These cards became extremely popular in Japan with families and illegal gangs. They even got to the point where Nintendo would collaborate with Disney to create Hanafuda of their characters. However, their success didn't last long after playing cards were unbanned in the 1900s, so Nintendo needed to innovate or die. They tried a lot of different things. They delivered instant rice to capitalize on the instant noodle craze at the time, they were a taxi service, they tried love hotels, but their most successful endeavor at the time was in the toy industry. Nintendo would make many successful toys, like wooden ducks, love testers, and the Ultra Hand. Many of these toys' success was thanks to Gunpei Yokoi, who designed most of them. At this time, Nintendo was dabbling in the game market, collaborating with Magnavox to create a flash gun for their games and distributing the Magnavox Odyssey in Japan. Eventually, Nintendo would create their own console called the Color TV game, which had games like a cheap Pong ripoff. Sadly, they were not nearly as successful as the Magnavox Odyssey. But Gunpei Yokoi struck again, when on a train he saw a bored businessman fiddling with his calculator. Then he would start designing a cheap device capable of playing games. And thus, the Game & Watch was born, a cheap gaming device using the same technology as a calculator, and it would double as a game device, and you guessed it, a watch. This was somewhat successful, but Nintendo would also develop arcade games at the time, one of which was the Radar Scope, which was a spaceship shooter game that was insanely successful in Japan. So, in order to capitalize on its success, Nintendo made 3,000 more machines to be sold in the US. But it wasn't nearly as successful over here, only selling about a third of the machines. So Nintendo would then task a new hire, Shigeru Miyamoto, with developing a new game for the same hardware. Miyamoto's first idea was to create a Popeye the Sailor game because Nintendo had the licensing for him at the time. But that idea would soon fall out after showcasing the game to the licensing company, in which would make Nintendo lose the license. After that, Miyamoto had to rework the game with his own characters, Pauline, Donkey Kong, and Jumpman, who would later be renamed Mario. The game was significantly more successful in the US and Japan, and had Nintendo make more games like it, such as DK Jr. and Mario Brothers, none of which would match the same success. They would then try the home console market once again with the Famicom, a new cartridge-based system. This would be a massive success, so Nintendo would again capitalize on it, and releasing it in the US as well as everywhere else. But they could not have chosen a worse time, because this was during the time where everyone was trying to make a video game system, which ended up overwhelming customers. And when games looked like this, no one was going to buy it. So, in order to appeal to the widest audience possible, they redesigned and renamed the system as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. They packed the system along with 2 controllers, a zapper gun, a cool robot that all the 80s kids wanted, along with Miyamoto's new killer app, Super Mario Bros., and the system had everything it needed. And by the time it was out, it would sell 61 million units, being the best performing system at the time. This system would get amazing games like Duck Hunt, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Punch-Out!, and B-52. and which would make this system the video game device at the time, until a new company came into the picture. Sega was a small Japanese company at the time, also trying to make it big in the console market. And they had recently launched their new system, the Sega Genesis, the first 16-bit console. Now, what does that mean? Basically, it just means the bigger the number, the better the fun. So, they even made a character named Sonic the Hedgehog to be a direct competitor towards Mario. So, Nintendo had to fire back with their own 16-bit system called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. This would be known as the first console war, with commercials at the time even targeting each other. But Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve, because they were working on a disk drive for the SNES with Sony so they could make games with way more bits and data space on CD discs. This was codenamed the PlayStation. But Nintendo, for unknown reasons today, pulled out of the deal with Sony to work with Philips instead. Now, what did they make together?
Lamp oil, rope, bombs. You want it? It's yours, my friend, as long as you have enough rubies.
Sony was reasonably mad, so they took the technology from the SNES add-on and made a worldwide phenomenon out of spite. But this wasn't the only thing Nintendo was doing at the time, because they were making Gunpei Yokoi's newest system called the Game Boy, a cheap, durable brick of a system packed with Tetris and sent out in the world, where it would eventually get the game Pokemon Red and Green in Japan and Pokemon Red and Blue in the US, making the system last far longer due to a massive boost in sales thanks to Pokemania and everyone wanting to do everything involving Pokemon. But Nintendo's next system was set to blow the PlayStation and the new Sega CD out of the water, was taking longer than expected to release. So Nintendo had to scratch something together in order to appease fans. And then the Virtual Boy was born, being the first virtual reality device. And it was a miserable failure, selling only 770,000 units, which when compared to the NES was pitiful. But people were still hopeful for a new system Nintendo was cooking up, named the Nintendo 64. It had a 64-bit processor that could fully showcase 3D worlds, a controller that, while odd, allowed for 360-degree movement rather than the 8 others gave. It had 4 controller ports built for ultimate multiplayer experience. They had everything to make a successful console, and it probably would have, if Nintendo didn't have to do their own thing. Nintendo was so scared of piracy they continued to use cartridges despite the other systems using CDs, which were superior in every single way. Cartridges held significantly less data, made games look worse, and were overall way more expensive to produce. This decision outraged third-party developers, which would have made the majority of the games for the system. That's why you don't see many games from Capcom, ID Software, Activision, and most infamously, Squaresoft. If you don't know who Squaresoft is, or better known as Square Enix today, they are the developers of the Final Fantasy franchise, which was the RPG at the time. They were originally going to develop their new game, Final Fantasy VII, for the Nintendo 64, but were outraged along with the other developers when they heard it would be using cartridges. Seeing an opportunity, though, Sony went to Square and offered them a deal to make Final Fantasy VII a PlayStation exclusive, to which Squaresoft agreed. Final Fantasy VII would then become the second best-selling PlayStation game, selling over 10 million units. This same story would happen with so many other developers, just moving to PlayStation, giving the Nintendo 64 almost no third-party support. This system would only sell 32 million units, which is especially pitiful when you compare it to the PlayStation's over 100 million. At this point, Microsoft was interested in joining the gaming industry, and tried to buy Nintendo, in which they just laughed at the mere thought of. Now with Sony, Microsoft, and Sega to worry about, Nintendo had to put everything into their next console, known as the GameCube. It would be more powerful than the PS2, have 4 controller ports with a new design for a wireless controller, and they finally caved and used discs. Still wasn't good. Instead of using the new DVD discs that the others were using, Nintendo was still scared of piracy to the point where Nintendo invented these tiny little discs that held more data than a CD, but were still hard to pirate. But they still also couldn't hold as much data as the competition, and were still more expensive to produce. And in the process of trying to appeal to the masses, they made the thing look like a lunchbox. The GameCube would only sell a total of 21 million units, while the PS2 sold a massive 155 million, which makes it today the best-selling system ever. At this point, Nintendo was getting most of their money from their handheld, the Game Boy Advance, a 32-bit system that could play all of the previous Game Boy games, and that has one of the best game libraries of all time, selling a total of 81 million units. At this point, Nintendo realized that they shouldn't blend in with the other systems, and they had to stand out with their new system, the Wii. Instead of targeting the seasoned gamer, the Wii targeted your grandma by introducing motion controls into gaming. So instead of doing an absurd button combination to swing a baseball bat, all you had to do was swing your controller like a baseball bat. Due to the simplicity of the system, it would sell 101 million units, destroying the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Nintendo, then showcasing that they would never learn from their mistakes, then thought to target the casual and seasoned gamers again, and made the system named the Wii U. And people coincidentally went,
"What in the world is this?"
The Wii U was confusing to many consumers, thinking it was just an accessory to the Wii. The ads for the thing didn't even help much either, due to it advertising itself as a kid's toy, rather than the thing people would actually want to buy, especially with the terrible writing the ads had.
With 2 free games.
Hot buttered popcorn, that's a deal!
Yeah.
The Wii U only sold 13 million units, making it Nintendo's second worst failure. At this point, Nintendo needed a new system fast because they were losing a lot of money on Wii U's. So, they took things from their best consoles and made the first hybrid system, named the Nintendo Switch, with the main gimmick of it being that you could play games on the TV and in your hands. The Nintendo Switch is by far Nintendo's best performing system, selling over 110 million units of the base model alone. The Switch has amazing games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Many now consider Nintendo to be in their golden age with the Nintendo Switch and other projects outside the gaming industry, such as the Mario movie, a Zelda movie in the making, and Super Nintendo World, with rumors of Nintendo's next console named the Switch attached. Nintendo future has never looked brighter. And that leads to my question from the beginning. Why is Nintendo so successful? I believe that Nintendo's success relies on their refusal to stay at industry norms, and instead targeting the hardcore gamer, they instead target kids and casual players that maybe don't have the time or money to dedicate to a massive new system, with difficult games like the PlayStation 5. And that there was my presentation on the history of Nintendo and why they're so successful. I really hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, you feel free to ask my in-person self. Thank you for watching.